We should be live.
Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody, and members of the public. We're going to talk about S210 this morning. Maybe vote, maybe not, but we want to. This is the successor to S79, which the governor vetoed. It's changed in a number of places, as I think we've heard from David Hall. The first thing, and I'll leave it to Josh and Sean if they have any comments on it or are not familiar with it, but we made changes on the complaint-driven issue in the governor's veto message. I haven't heard any negative feedback on that language. We made changes to make sure that the crime fits the punishment, so we don't have units closed down for a cracked window. I haven't heard any objection to that language. So we're down to pretty much exemptions. I do feel like that the goalposts have been moved a little bit in the sense that we're hearing, I think, sort of for the first time, that perhaps there shouldn't be any transfer over to Department of Fire and Safety at all, or on some sort of transitional phasing or hybrid model. But before we get into that, I would like to have Josh and Sean, whoever go first, just one of the other issues we have to do is whether we're going to include the VHIP bill, VHIP program in this bill as it was in S79, and also the revolving loan home ownership program. Is that the right name that we've given the second one, Josh?
It works. We know what you mean by it.
Okay.
I can't remember if we called it a purchase and repair home ownership revolving loan fund originally, but it makes sense how you've referred to it. Okay.
Let's talk about VHIP first. I think, and thank you for being with us repeatedly on this. I think you said last time that the VHIP program is being run exactly as it was passed by the House and the Senate in S79. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, and I kind of gave a high-level, quick summary last week, and I may at this point, if it's okay with the committee, maybe have Sean give a little bit more detail and background where we are. He's been, directly overseeing the program with the 5 regional home ownership centers and all the groups involved, and it's been a lot of work, but a lot of success. 251 units from the first $7.2 million of CRF funding, and then the $5 million of ARPA funding, state fiscal recovery funds, that was approved in the budget last year. That has all been obligated to the home ownership centers as well. They had more requests than we had funding available, and had expressed concerns about sort of stopping and starting the program, how it was stressful for their staff, their commitments to the landlords, and that was the basis for our BAA request to continue the program, knowing that we're already fully obligated within this year and could keep this program going seamlessly, and considering the success of bringing on units and largely serving those families exiting homelessness. This was critical for our efforts to address those needs. And in short term, maybe I'll have Sean just give a background of how it's being run now and how it relates to what you did instruct us to run the program with the CRF funds, 2 years ago. Sean, would you mind kind of going through some of that?
Certainly. Good morning, everybody. Sean Gilpin with the Department of Housing and Community Development. Good to see you all, and happy to be talking about this program again. So just real quick background, and I think it's at risk of being redundant. I think it is important to kind of go through a little bit of the history of how this program's rolled out since the discussions in S79 and the CARES Act, because we have been able to tinker around the edges. I would say that we have substantially stuck to the outlines in S79 of how to run the program, but there have been some tweaks as we've learned things. And I think that's helpful to understand when we're talking about codifying this program for the future. So folks will recall we received some funds through CRF, the CARES Act, which is what prompted us to start this program. The parameters at the time were grants of up to $30,000 per unit to private property owners who connected with the homeownership centers. It required at the time a 10% match, and there was a 5-year affordability covenant whereby the property owners committed to 5 years of renting the unit at or below HUD fair market rent, which generally speaking is the rental rate at which somebody can use a Section 8 voucher. They weren't required to rent to somebody with a Section 8 voucher or do income verification, but they needed to keep the rental rate at that affordability level for at least 5 years. We also originally required that that the property owner at least review a minimum of 3 referrals from the continuum of care organizations, which is HUD's word for the network of homeless service providers throughout the state. They were not obligated to rent to any of those referrals, but they had to have that open communication with the COC. Ultimately, we ended up, well, before I go there, the folks will recall that the program started up in August of 2020, and originally the CARES Act was obligated or what needed to be spent by the end of that calendar year. So it was a huge breakneck pace. We weren't sure, frankly, how much we were going to be able to accomplish with it in such a short amount of time, but it ended up, thanks to huge efforts by the Homeownership Center, we ended up getting a whole bunch of units online before, at the 11th hour, the United States Congress extended the use of those funds for an additional year. So after that extension, we ended up doing sort of a second round, a phase 2, if you will, with largely all the same parameters with the exception of that referral. In phase 2, property owners were required to commit to renting to somebody who was referred by the continuum of care organization. So they had to rent to somebody who was exiting homelessness for that 5-year term of affordability.
Can I stop you there?
Certainly.
So I just want to understand how it's working on the ground. When you were trying to meet the expenditures of that $5 million with CARES money, was it sufficient for you just to get the money out the door to the nonprofits, or did you have to actually do the renovation and complete the renovation and get even further, get the tenant in there by December 31st? I understand you got a reprieve for another year, but were you under the assumption from, what's the name of our group, Bright Star or something like that?
Guidehouse. Yeah.
Guidehouse. So what was the understanding?
Our understanding based off of the US Treasury guidance for that was that there needed to be a demonstrated benefit by the end of the calendar year, which means that we needed to have the unit available and quite possibly filled. So that was the assumption we were working under before the extension. And
you were able to get a lot of the $5 million out the door to landlords who were then able to find contractors and get the renovations done? So it was actually closer to 7 million from the CARES. We have 5 million in ARPA right now to continue the program, but we did get substantially, we got almost all of the money into the hands of the home ownership centers, and much of it was obligated with benefits accruing before the end of the calendar year. There was additional US Treasury guidance that allowed for some level of extension if there were demonstrated holdups because of COVID-related issues. So supply chain issues, contractor can't show up because their workers are sick. So we actually worked
very hard at the end, in December of 2020 to try to get documentation together so that we could have those extensions for the few that hadn't wrapped up. And then the U.S. Congress changed the rules on us, so we didn't need all that documentation after all to continue. So as of the end of last year, we've completed 251 units with that. It was about $7.2 million of funding. So now in the ARPA funded version of this, so the $5 million allocation that you folks provided last year's budget, we reached out to the homeownership centers again. They already had people in the pipeline. It was a very popular program. Folks were very interested, and we kind of floated the idea with them of what if we stick with that requirement from the phase 2 of the CARES Act that you must rent to somebody exiting homelessness, with we left ourselves a little bit of opening for some exceptions for extenuating circumstances. The homeownership centers felt that they wouldn't have a problem at all with getting property owners lined up for this program, even with that caveat, that contingency, and have since they collectively requested more than the $5 million allocation that we had just to start up this program. So we're continuing now. We're finalizing some of the documentation that they'll need to use, trying to standardize this a little bit so that it's a bit more organized than we move fast and furious with the CARES Act, but definitely need more structure as far as our own internal record keeping and whatnot, and just increasing efficiencies of the program. But the program parameters itself, as far as the benefit to property owners, are the same as what I described, up to $30,000 grants. We actually increased it to a 20% match. Forgive me, that was a change. 5-year affordability covenant and 5 years renting to a household exiting homelessness. And we actually identified what are called the coordinated entry lead organizations, which are some of the more sophisticated outfits that actually have access to databases of individuals who have touched the homeless service system. So trying to make that a little bit more clear for the landlords, for the property owners, who they should be talking to get these referrals. Ultimately, in trying to anticipate some questions here, we of the 251 units that were brought back online through the CARES Act funding, we're approaching 50% that are serving folks who are exiting homelessness. So, and then obviously with this new fund, we anticipate that to be close to 100% with a few exceptions. That said, I will also say that the language in S79, in addition to allowing for rental rehabilitation of existing units, we also did allow for the creation of accessory dwelling units. However, we found that very few actually took advantage of that opportunity, in part because the original timeline was just, way too difficult to try to get a brand new unit online in a matter of months. But secondly, we have found that while on average the grants that went out during the CARES Act funding, they averaged about $23,000. So people actually weren't maxing out on the 30. But we found that most of the folks who were interested in an accessory dwelling unit and looked into it found that the 30,000 really wasn't quite enough to make the numbers work. So I think it's worthy of discussion whether that 30,000 is exactly the right amount, especially as we've seen the cost of building supplies and labor going up, in the last couple of years. So I think it's worth a conversation about if there should be some flexibility about those maximums. But that's how the program's been running, and that's how we intend to continue it for at least the foreseeable future.
So you mentioned something about how you worked with the legislature in developing the first CARES program in this with the $7 million of CARES funding. Can you refresh my memory? What was the vehicle for working with the legislature to get our input?
I don't know if Josh, you want to take that or?
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, as we were all discussing how to allocate CARES money, we worked on this program It was the first time we raised it to $30,000. If you remember talking about VHIP before the pandemic started, we were talking about a $7,500 benefit in much different parameters. And so as we started seeing the immediate need and the challenges in these CARES funding, we worked to establish this $30,000, the match and everything through your committee and House General, and really codified it in legislation to allocate the CARES money that year. I can't remember exactly if it was just in the budget there was this detail, or it was a separate appropriation for CARES funding, I believe, because it was that first year, the legislature, you guys also continued all the way into the summer. And so that's why we couldn't launch the program until August, because I don't think we had it wrapped up until July. So it was done in coordination with many of you working out that $30,000, and at the time, the 10% match.
Josh, two things that I'd like to see. Could you just track that down, whether there was any bills floating around or language regarding VHIP that either made it in the budget or didn't make it in the budget? I remember this committee being very involved and talking about it, but I don't know exactly how it ended up. And the second thing is, we're talking about a program now that got $7 million and $5 million and now another $20 million. That's $32 million. And at least in statute or rules, we have no parameters to this program, a $32 million program. Now, you may have guidelines and they're in writing somewhere and the practice, but I would assume there is some written material somewhere that governs this program, whether, the contracts, you have boilerplate stuff, but we're talking a lot of money here. And I guess one of the things I would ask you folks, do you want us to pass a law defining this program, or do you just want to keep going the way you're going?
Well, two things just to respond to that, Senator. Sure, we'll definitely look up where the first VHIP, we called it Rehousing Recovery Program that first year, because it was focused on a number of rehousing issues we were tackling. But this recovery relief federal funding in various forms, there's been a lot of funding that's gone out. Yeah,
I found it. It was S-163.
Okay.
It was the bill we did on an act relating to housing, safety, and rehabilitation. I'm pretty sure it was S-163, having done it on the floor. I found it. So there we are.
Thank you, Senator. Yep.
Yeah, Senator, I was just commenting that, with all this incredible amount of pandemic relief funding we've had, I think there's been lots of large allocations going to address issues that haven't had as much of a spelled out program behind them as we would do with typical general funds. I mean, we were talking about establishing VHIP with, a $7,000 grant and all these additional parameters for general fund with, maybe a $1 million initial allocation way back 3-4 years ago. And, what I would say is we definitely support a policy and parameters around an ongoing VHIP program. I think the difference becomes, in order for us to address the immediate needs of the pandemic and use these temporary recovery funds to address the current need, we have a framework to address that now, and that's going to end. And it's a tremendous amount of money. The congressional intent was to move these funds and to help address these needs, and we're doing that, and we feel like we're following the guidance of the legislature and addressing the needs out there. But I think that's different than an ongoing program to support rental rehabilitation, private-public partnerships on largely private owners here with state general funds. I think that does have a more robust policy discussion and to codify this behind it. And so, I would offer that we really have two things going on here.
Okay, I appreciate that. So so can you give me so I still would like to see paperwork of what you're doing now, applications, how you get in, what are the form contracts at this point. So you're saying you have made a change to everybody that's being rented to now under a VHIP, in an apartment that benefited from the VHIP grant is coming out of homelessness?
Currently, yes. Yep. So we're really in phase 3 right now. The first was the CRF phase 1, which just had this soft entry because we didn't know if we'd get the uptake to require 3 referrals of folks exiting homelessness. We found out that as we dispersed the second batch of that CRF funding, the homeownership centers had no problem working with landlords that were willing to take the requirement to receive folks exiting homelessness. So we took them up on that, found out that that worked, and we launched this phase 3 with the first batch of ARPA money and $5 million under those requirements. And we're expecting somewhere around 140 units, 150 units from this $5 million. The vast majority, as Sean said, serving folks exiting homelessness. We have a few relief valves. For example, if someone completes a unit, it's ready and it's been sitting vacant for 3 or 4 weeks with no referrals coming. They can request to help someone else that is maybe in jeopardy of becoming homeless because they need an apartment. There's no reason to sit on an apartment for more than a month that's open and available if the local organization isn't able to refer someone exiting homelessness. And so that's the relief valve, but they need to receive, authority to do that. This additional 20 million in BAA, I think we've been open, and certainly my testimony to joint fiscal over the summer, to Senate appropriations, House appropriations, it is if we want to address more ADUs, bringing more ADUs online, and some of the apartments that were offline that had minor fixes, we're starting to hit all those easy ones, right? So the expenses are rising, both because we need more extensive work in these units. There's a desire to do ADUs, and these ADUs are going to be serving low-income folks exiting homelessness, not being turned into short-term rentals, which is what I think we all want. These expenses are going up. So we might need flexibility in this 20 million to have higher parameters than the 30,000 cap, as well as what is the right point with an additional 400 plus units coming online that we turn off that 100% requirement to serve folks exiting homelessness, but still require it to be affordable housing, for 5 years. What is that right balance? And this program doesn't work unless the homeownership centers can find willing property owners and they can make it work. We could have all the best intentions, but we're working in reality of what the market is doing out there, what's available for units, what contractors will work on, what the actual material costs are. And so I think under this pandemic relief funding, we need to have some of that flexibility, that we're happy to do, check-in reports, have some high-level parameters with input from you all. But I think to really be successful and move this much money this quick with the congressional intent behind these funds, there is some flexibility needed there.
Thank you very much, Senator Clarkson.
Thanks, Josh and Sean. Do you have, maybe I just have missed it, but do you have the BAA language on that 20 million additional and ask? And if it includes the ADUs, I'd just like to see the language. I don't think we've seen that language. And as it has to come to the Senate also, it would be great for us to have seen that before our Senate Appropriations Committee takes it up.
Sure. I can pull it off the House Appropriations and send it over to you. It's pretty simple. It just is a couple sentences talking about rehabbing, making units available for, this effort. It's not very lengthy because it's essentially amending it's already in last year's appropriation to add an additional 20 million to the 5 million.
Right. But again, there's no language setting up that program in the budget from last year. And there's no language in the budget about the ADUs. So the, it's funny because it further enforces the existence of the program without yet the language and statutory structure to set it up. So,
right. I think
it is the cart going before the horse.
I think Josh gave a pretty good, fair justification.
Yeah.
Why? And there's a tension there. How much does the legislature, and we see it in every program we deal with, how much does the legislature get involved with the pressure of getting the money out the door, and we have a slightly different view of that than maybe the executive branch does. But this
I think one of the challenges in Act 74, where all these ARPA funds were allocated, there's a number of funding that goes for an initiative without a real program behind it. There's sort of money to address healthy drinking water. Well, what is that? There's language about the intent of the money and not the programs behind it, because we have to follow the federal legislation rules of how it's addressing the pandemic, how it's helping recovery. I mean, there is federal intent behind what these funds have to go for. That's our, top line, what we need to follow. And then the budget language about here's what we want you to spend it on within those federal guidelines. And you're right, it does leave some opening, and happy to talk through as much of this as possible.
I get and appreciate all that. It's just the mention of the ADUs. I'd love to see your language and the money around the ADUs, which is different.
Yeah. Well, and I think our program parameters, our program guidance, where we have the covenants and the application, we clearly state you can do ADUs with these funds to our home ownership centers. And the feedback we had, because what I was asked a few times, how many do you think we've done? Is we did very few because of the time and the money. But I think what I hear often is there's intent to do more ADUs, and this is probably a really good vehicle to do it. All I'm saying is if that's the case, I don't think $30,000 is enough to convince a property owner, because these are costing $70,000, $80,000 to do an ADU. And they're more than halfway funding it themselves, and with the restrictions of exiting someone out of homelessness, it just is not sort of penciling out.
So I guess my follow-up is, what are you proposing as a grant for ADUs?
Well, we're contemplating raising this up to $50,000 with some sort of greater benefit to those that commit to serving those exiting homelessness. Maybe their grant would be up to $50,000, and we would keep the $30,000 grant to those that are, committing to make this affordable to folks at 80% of AMI and below, trying to incentivize that goal by offering more funding. And, maybe we could also say, or creation of a new unit like an ADU. We're open to whatever thoughts you want to put on this, but, we're just expressing that the dollar amounts are increasing. And to have the flexibility to do more, it's going to need some flexibility above the $30,000 that we're operating under in good faith, because that was the intent of the legislation behind this. The other thing I want to add is just the first CRF money. I mean, the numbers are remarkable. I mean, just looking at this list right here, we did 19 units in Brattleboro, 17 in Springfield, 12 in Windsor. And the list, I've just, I know, just looking at a few faces on the screen, your communities, this is a lot of units that have a great benefit to the families exiting homelessness. Many of these were with children, and we've interviewed these property owners, these landlords that said, we would have not done this. This property would be sitting here. It's very expensive to change out heating systems and plumbing and electrical, and this program made it feasible to go ahead and do this. And they feel part of the solution to the challenges they see in their community when they see families that are homeless staying in a motel. They feel like they are part of solving that problem and are proud to do it. So, if you're looking for any names to talk to, we can refer those, and happy to answer any more questions. But I think you're getting the gist of it.
Good. So I was going to ask Sean, could you give us a couple of simple examples that you're aware of and what the price tag was, what the landlord contributed, and are all these are all these units required to be vacant before they start getting renovation put in them? Are we creating new units, or are we just fixing up an ongoing rental in any way?
So I'll start from the final question and work forward. So in this phase 3, as we've tagged it now, there is a vacancy requirement. For the CARES Act funding, we focused largely on vacant units. We did allow for a few instances where a unit had not been vacated, but was at risk of losing their, the certificate of occupancy is not the right term, but at risk of becoming uninhabitable, but had a household living in them. An example, we had, I think it was in the Washington County area, property owner had a unit, had a building, 4 units, and the septic system failed. He didn't have the capital in order to make the repairs quickly, so it was at risk of dislocating 4 families. We allowed for a CARES Act rehousing recovery program grant to be used to allow him to keep the septic system working so that those families didn't get displaced. A couple other examples sort of like that, where somebody with a Section 8 housing choice voucher had an inspection. It didn't meet the housing quality standards. The property owner themselves were low income and were, needed a little bit of assistance in order to avoid that displacement. Largely, though, we focused on creation of new units, or the bringing back online of units that were underutilized. So it's not technically a unit creation, but it functionally created a new unit because they were otherwise unavailable. It's a little difficult to, sorry, what was that?
I was just going to say, so some of us are big fans of ADUs, and the ADUs are not, you don't get the most bang for your buck with an ADU, because the price tag to create a whole new unit or carve out a unit within the house is generally more expensive than fixing a plumbing or electrical or insulating the house or something like that. Plus, do one of them versus the other have more permitting problems? Sometimes does an ADU require a permit, or all of the things you're dealing with generally don't require a permit because they're within the same footprint?
It varies between municipalities. Largely speaking, if you're not expanding the footprint, it's a lesser of a permitting issue than if you're trying to create a new building on a plot, which is one of the reasons why we focused largely on existing structures. So whether that was converting a carriage house that was already there into something that could be rented out, or in most cases where truly brand new units were created, it was carving up larger homes, creating apartments within an existing structure that was no longer really marketable with the number of bedrooms that were in there. I don't know that I would go so far to say that ADUs are less bang for the buck. I understand the thought behind that. They do tend to be slightly more expensive than some of the rehabs that we've experienced, but you are then creating a truly brand new, completely new unit and increasing the housing stock that way. So I think they're just another important sort of piece of the puzzle. Like I said before, the average grant amount for the CARES funded VHIP was around $23,000. Some of the examples of things that we found, actually NeighborWorks of Western Vermont, and I'm happy to share the links to these. They did a number of really great, they did one long video and then broke it down into a couple vignettes, speaking with property owners. But oftentimes, especially in that region, it was things where you had a property owner who was about to do a renovation, then realized after pulling down the drywall that all of the electrical was out of date, old knob and tube wiring that needed to be replaced, and realized that they were sort of stuck in their tracks. This helped bring units online a lot faster than they would have happened otherwise. As Josh mentioned, we had heating unit replacements, and then, a lot of places were it was just real rundown, like needed rehab, units that just had been sitting vacant after perhaps being damaged, or a previous owner had been neglectful and somebody had bought it up and not realized quite how much investment really needed to go to bring the unit, bring the building back online. Things like that, replacing failing appliances and things like that folks needed to have in order to maintain the rental unit. So those were some of the things, some examples of what we ended up funding with these grants.
You give money out to these nonprofits. Is it you're around the whole state, I assume, at this point? Okay.
Yes, yeah. The 5 home ownership centers jointly, in collaboration, they cover all 14 counties.
And how do you determine how much to give to each nonprofit?
We for the very first round, we did it relatively equitably in terms of the amount of funding that we had, and then since then, we had a number of enhancements, and money was shifted around from one home ownership center to another based on demand and what they were receiving. That's how we've stuck pretty close to an even five-way split, 20% for each, but it has fluctuated based on what they perceive as their pipeline, their wait lists.
So the example you gave about the 4 units with the plumbing, that unit would, I don't know if they got 4 times as much money, but drilling it down to 1 unit, they could get up to 30,000, and then the landlord would have to put in at least 6,000 and sometimes more to pay for the bills. Is that the way it works?
Yes. So I think in that instance, they received, I think it was actually a $30,000 grant. The homeowner, for that time, it was a 10% match, but they put in far more than that. In fact, we found generally that property owners were putting in much more than the minimum match requirement. I don't have stats on it right in front of me, but and then the way that it worked, since they got the equivalent of a 1-unit grant, even though it was a 4-unit building, they needed to identify one of the units in that building that would fit under the affordability covenant for that amount of time. So they'll report on that to us. And the method that we use to do that is we require in the program guidelines program requirements that the property owners submit to us the same landlord certificate that they submit to the Department of Taxes that outlines the rental rates. And that's how we're keeping track of making sure that folks are renting out at those fair market rents for the 5 years. And we can cross-check that with the tax department just to ensure that we're getting accurate information.
So you're in charge of monitoring compliance with the rental rates, not the homeowners.
Not the homeowners centers, no. We asked so much of them just to run this program. We took on the reporting requirements on our own.
Senator Brock.
A question regarding rental rates. Based on your experience, these rental rates that are established, are they reflective of what's actually being charged in the marketplace, or are they higher or lower?
Frankly, it sort of depends where you look around the state. I think it fluctuates. They're county based in Vermont. Else, in other places in the nation, there's higher population densities, so they go closer to census tracts. But it's republished by the Department of Housing and Urban Development every year. And I don't want to go into too deep in the weeds, but basically HUD does surveys of market rate rentals, and then they set the fair market rent such that at least I think it's at least 60%, or I think it's 40% of the units are available at that rate. So to put it bluntly, I think Vermont often gets lowballed, and the rates that HUD publishes are actually slightly less than what the market would really bear at an affordability rate for somebody at 80% AMI or below. We often actually have to do sort of counter studies to send back to HUD to see if they'll change the rates. I don't want to get too over my ski tips here, but I think it'll be really interesting the next couple of years, given how the rental rates have changed in Vermont post, since COVID. So it'll be interesting to see what those HUD surveys come in. But I think it is the most accurate and probably the fairest and most consistent metric that we can do, shy of doing our own surveys, which we'd need a whole department just to do that sort of thing.
Well, is the information that these rental rates are based on, is that publicly available, easily available, for example, for a landlord to look at and test before making a decision to enter the program?
Yes, we actually point landlords to the Vermont Housing Finance Agency and the Vermont State Housing Authority. Both publish a table that frankly makes it a lot easier to read than what HUD puts out, which is also publicly available.
Yes, Senator. Before the property owners, receive the grant and sign an agreement and so forth, they're notified and agreeing what the rents are, and based on this fair market rent calculation by HUD, which can change every year. Housing vouchers allow rent to go up each year because if the published rent goes up, and so it is in a pretty acceptable, might not be perfect, 100% accurate, but it's a pretty acceptable metric that people point to for fair market rent. That is what we're using this to base this program on. One thing that I'll just add. That's been interesting as we've, brought 251 units online, and people are noticing that there's more efforts to, bring vacant, abandoned, blighted properties in apartments online, and talk about ADUs. Is we're having a lot of folks reach out to us, like the Dale. They want to see these apartments be as accessible as possible. If we're building apartments, we have a population that has disabilities, that are elderly. Can we make these apartments as accessible as possible? That was the impetus behind the town of St. Johnsbury doing a program that kicked some money back from their registry to fix up apartments, because they found that their old housing stock was not accessible for their own residents. And so we're being looked to address that issue with this program, make these units accessible. We're also being looked to coordinate with weatherization and Efficiency Vermont's efforts. There isn't another program that we're aware of that is bringing this many units online within existing properties targeted to low-income folks, where there's a chance to bring tons of good policy together and other resources and make these units, as beneficial to the general public in an ongoing way. And so we're excited about all these conversations. Haven't figured them all out, but people are starting to point to this program and the number of units we're bringing on as a place to make other efforts that are good policy to realize those goals.
When a person is assigned by an agency or otherwise because they meet the income requirements for a particular property, does the landlord have any choice, or must they accept whoever is sent to them?
The landlord has choice, and we actually don't. We intentionally set the rental rates that they charge, but not necessarily doing an income verification of the incoming tenant. Granted that, now that we're requiring a connection with the coordinated entry agency, so they'll have tenants who are almost certainly below 80% area median income, but the landlord actually has they have as much choice as they like to have. They don't need to take whomever, and that has actually proved to be a challenge in terms of improving communication to make sure that the continuation, or the COC the homeless service provider organizations are aware that they need to work with the landlord to find somebody who's suitable, both in terms of family size and the like, but also making sure that the person has the ability to pay, has a voucher, has the services provided. And so part of this program, I'd say one of the softer benefits of this program, even before the coordinated entry requirement, was we saw a lot of property owners who were unaware of their local homeless service provider. And this actually created a line of communication between a private property owner who was more than willing to work with those folks, but just didn't really know how to get in the door. And we actually, admittedly, we have heard from some of the home ownership centers who have had property owners that benefited from this program then turn around and use the connections that they made to bring people exiting homelessness into other units that weren't involved with VHIP. And that's the sort of success story that I'd like to hear going forward. But ultimately, yes, the property owner can decide to whom they rent.
Sarah Clarkson.
So Sean, just as I'm just curious, does the coordinated entry program keep track of people so that we can study over time the impact of all these programs working together to solve a problem? So do we, just often our lack of data is such a frustration. And I'm just curious if they track these people exiting homelessness with the VHIP program, how long are they going to stay? I mean, do they have a mechanism for long-term tracking? And when is a family exiting homelessness or a person considered now housed? I mean, how many years do they have to be housed and consistently housed to be considered now a housed unit, family unit? And anyway.
Sure. Yeah. So not to obfuscate or dodge, but that's probably those sort of details are probably best for our colleagues at the Agency of Human Services who oversee these organizations. Although I will say that coordinated entry is the name comes from literally entering information into a database. So they use what's called the Homeless Management Information Service. So it's HMIS for short. And the way that works is basically if I go down the street to COTS and apply for assistance there, and then find myself moving down to Barry and going to Good Samaritan Haven, Good Sam will already have my information from when I went to COTS, so I don't have to go through the application process over and over again. That was the goal of coordinated entry, is to basically have as close to a single door of entry as possible. And there are a lot of organizations that feed information into this or draw from it. So there is quite a bit of tracking. I know that I don't want to commit AHS or our coordinated entry folks to stuff that they can't deliver, because I know it's always difficult to report out information that includes personally identifiable information, PII as we call it in wonky land. But I know that there is a certain amount of tracking, but I can't answer right now at what point somebody is extricated from the list of having been homeless.
So, Josh, we're going to finish up on this, spend a couple of minutes on the revolving loan, and then we'll get to the heart of the bill after our break. But you are obviously familiar with what happened 20 years ago. I know Sarah's very familiar with all these incentivized public housing projects for private landlords. I think they were called the 202 programs or whatever. And all of a sudden, the affordability aspect got dropped off, and they had taken the incentives, and all of a sudden they turned their housing into the private marketplace, private market rates. And all of a sudden we had a big, huge problem on our hands. Is this too small for you not to worry about it? Is 5 years enough? Are we going to start seeing people, in upgraded apartments getting good rents now, and then 5 years from now, I don't have this obligation anymore? And
I think you bring up a good question. I think that that program had a lot of large properties as well, 15, 20 units, and if that all converts, looking for better opportunities with the restrictions gone, that's a much bigger challenge in a community than 3 or 4 units here, 3 or 4 units there. Still a challenge for those residents, I think the bigger problem was ongoing incentives didn't continue. Even if they would have been smaller, if you could have continued some sort of effort to keep those units in the affordable realm, like we do with all tax credit projects, all public housing, all nonprofit owned housing, there's ongoing support to make those properties, to keep those properties in good shape. And with that continued support goes a continued commitment to serve those at lower income. I think that the problem was it was a benefit that just ended, a cliff, and folks were stuck with the owners' choices to make about, whether you could raise rent and keep up with their own maintenance and bills. And, these properties all have considerable operating costs that continue to increase and rise with, you name it, whether it's property taxes, costs of repairs, new energy efficiency measures, there's ongoing costs. And I think it's better to have a program that is available to continue to bring supply online with affordability at any level we can get it. The basic problem we have out there is a lack of supply. We have a scarcity, and any units online that are rental home ownership will bring costs down. And that is our biggest challenge. I think, even entering into this discussion about the rental registry and code enforcement, the one thing I wanted to mention is that, if you looked at that story in 7 days and the VPR article, right, about, locked out and cockroaches and locked out, what was interesting about that story was the majority of units were in 2 municipalities that had much stronger rental registry and code enforcements than S79 or 210 suggest. They have proactive inspections and they have a duty to register and all of that, but they still couldn't solve the problem and address those tenants' issues because the tenants ultimately had no choice. If they had a different apartment to move to, they could say, forget this landlord, I have some choice. They have no choice right now. And we have to get at the heart of that problem to have any bureaucracy work as efficiently as it could. And that is what VHIP is doing. That is what bringing more units online can do. If folks have choice, all these systems work better. But right now, someone is stuck in the crappiest apartment they live in with government attempts by these municipalities that have more enforcement and a higher duty than what we're proposing when S210, and they still can't solve the problem. And that's because people don't have choice of a place to get up and go when their landlord is not providing them safe, decent housing. And so I think that is the biggest problem we face is scarcity is out. We have scarcity and people are stuck in awful situations and have no choice and no way out. And we have to solve that problem, number one, for everything else to work better.
Okay. I respectfully disagree with the fact that the town of Essex has which I grew up in and raised my family in, and know the town health officer who has been constantly emailing me saying we have to pass S79 because the town health officer system in his town and every other town doesn't work. So we're not going to debate that right now. I do want to ask you the $20 million that's in the budget adjustment, if that gets signed by, let's say, the end of February or the middle of February, are you realistically going to be able to spend $20 million in 4.5 months?
We have until 2025 to spend those funds. And the goal is to continue this program seamlessly so that the homeownership centers don't have to worry about laying off the staff that they have working on the program now, and they can keep bringing on new properties without stopping and starting. And so the money carries forward to the end of the state fiscal recovery funding deadlines is the plan.
Okay. And
we will spend it before September 30, 2025, which I believe is the deadline for it will be spent before then for sure, this 20 million. But it'll likely be over the course of probably 18 to 24 months.
And just to clarify, the 20 million is for VHIP and ADUs.
Yes, yeah,
VHIP
VHIP includes an ADU allowable component.
Right, right.
It doesn't technically say that anywhere. Does it say it in that one sentence that was in your last year's bill?
It says rehabilitation program, something along those lines. And the S79, language has ability to do
Right.
ADUs. And in our agreements with our homeownership centers, we've already enabled ADUs. The problem was the short timelines we were working under and the cap at $30,000. But we have every intention. We're going to run out of vacant apartments that are need to be fixed up, and ADUs is a great way to continue bringing new stock online. So we have every intention to do ADUs with these funds.
And let's talk about the $1 million that was in the budget for the revolving loan fund. I understand that hasn't been started up. Is it your intention to start it up in the remaining months of this year? Is that money reverting to another place at this point? What guidelines would you be working under if you set that up?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a little different. This was general funds that were put towards this effort. Without the policy there, it was one place that we had a little bit more hesitation of the ability to go ahead and launch this program. If we do, it will be following the intent that was in the policy in S79. To be frank and honest, we've been, involved in the $300 million rental assistance effort, involved in the $50 million mortgage assistance effort, VHIP, other CARES Act funds, recovery housing from HUD. We just haven't been able to get to this $1 million effort. And it's doubly challenging since it was general fund and we were in this situation of not having a policy to codify it.
Okay. Any other questions? We're going to take we'll take a break till 10 after 11. Hopefully we can get David Hall in here as well. I'm going to talk about the veto and S210 and where these two programs we've just been talking about fit into that whole mix. So Senator Cluxton, did you want to give me a call anymore? Or we're pretty much got it covered at this point? I know we had tentatively.
We never have it fully covered because there's so much to cover.
Okay.
But